Okay, kia ora team, welcome to our second block of content before exam 2. So this week and next week we have the cardiorespiratory system part 1 and part 2. So we've combined these two systems because they function together pretty heavily, and some of the concepts link from one to the other, so it sort of makes a bit of sense to join them. So first part that we're going to look at is the respiratory system. We're going to be looking at being able to label the organs of the respiratory system and identify the overall function of the system. So let's look at the basic function respiratory system to supply the body. So the body, think of the body as the different cells that you have within your body with oxygen, and we know that oxygen is a big part of producing big amounts of ATP, and as a byproduct we produce carbon dioxide as a gas, so get rid of carbon dioxide. There's 4 separate stages in providing this function. We've got pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing in and out or moving air in and out of the lungs. External respiration, and that is when we have gas moving from our lungs and into our blood, or blood into our lungs, so the exchange between lungs and blood. Then we have transport, which is the physical transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide between our lungs and our tissues, so that's our cardiovascular system. And then internal respiration, which is gas exchange happening between blood and your body's cells and tissues. Okay, so this pulmonary ventilation, external and internal respiration is the fundamental concepts of the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system combined. As usual, we'll look at some structures. Being familiar with this diagram will be important for examinable stuff, but understanding these structures helps with understanding physiology. So we have our nose, which filters and warms air. That warm moist air helps with increasing efficiency of gas exchange. So your mouth doesn't do this, so your nose is a better space for improving respiratory function. Your pharynx is the next structure down, which is a shared space for food and for your breathing tube, so we mentioned this in the digestive system. Then you have your epiglottis, which shuts off your larynx when you swallow, so that food goes down the esophagus and not into your lungs. The larynx is sitting underneath. Think of larynx as a breathing tube only. Larynx starts with L. L is also the starting letter for loud, and that helps me remember that the larynx is also your voice box, or contains your vocal cords, which are just little tissues that vibrate when you're making noises. Larynx also starts with L, and so does lower, and so I think of larynx as lower than the pharynx because it's a common, those two terms can commonly be confused with each other. Your trachea is the next tube. It's your breathing tube only. It looks and functions a little bit like a vacuum cleaner hose, so it has these cartilage rings that function all the way down the trachea, and that stops it from collapsing in on itself when you breathe. Within that structure you also have ciliated epithelial cells. So cilia are like little finger-like extensions that protrude out from the surface of your respiratory system, and the functions of those cilia are to catch foreign debris or substances within the air you breathe that shouldn't be in there, or disrupt external respiration. So if you're breathing in air that's is quite dirty with substances, then those cilia will catch those substances. Mucus is released, and that helps trap those substances in one spot, and you can either cough and spit them out, or cough and then swallow that, which goes into your digestive system. Stomach is acidic, that kills off bacteria, and you deal with the foreign debris that way. Here's a diagram of different structures within the respiratory system. Just note that on the previous slide we didn't have the diaphragm, which sits as a muscle that sits up inside the ribs. When it contracts, it pulls down, and you've also got little intercostal muscles that sit in between your ribs. And then the other structure is your pleura, which is the connective tissue sac that goes around your lungs. Within the two layers of that pleura is liquid, and it creates this cavity which has fluid, so that when your lungs move up and down when you breathe, it reduces the amount of friction in your space, in that space. And your heart has a similar kind of cavity that also reduces friction. So let's look at more structure. Your trachea comes down and then it splits off into your left and right primary bronchus. So bronchus is the next tube off the trachea, and then you have from there your secondary and then tertiary bronchi. So these are just smaller branches of the original primary bronchus. These tubes get smaller and smaller and smaller as they split deeper into the lungs. And here's a visual of that with the actual lung tissue stripped off. So we're just looking at the different trachea structures. So you got your trachea down the middle, then it splits off into your left and right primary bronchus. The next time it splits, you will have your secondary bronchus. So think of like primary school, next step is secondary school, and then they'll split off again into your tertiary bronchus. And then at the ends of your tertiary bronchus structures, you have the smallest tubes, which are your bronchioles. At the end of your bronchioles, and think of bronchioles as like the smallest twigs, if you were to think of it as like a tree branch, which hold our alveoli, or the sacs which hold the ear. And think of them as like grapes. If you think of a bunch of grapes, the bronchioles are the little sticks or twigs that hold grapes, and those grapes are ear sacs. And this creates our respiratory zone, and this is the site where gas exchange happens. So the respiratory zone is where our internal respiration happens. Our external respiration happens, where gas moves from our lungs to our blood. All other respiratory passages that we've just talked about, so like your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, they are all conducting zone structures, meaning air is moving through them, but no gas is lost inside of those structures. It's just when you reach the respiratory zone where gas within the mixture of air can escape or be absorbed. So oxygen escaping, CO2 jumping on board. This is just a zoomed up version of the alveolus, or the air sacs next to your capillaries of your cardiovascular system, and you can see the two arrows are showing oxygen, so high concentration of oxygen at your lungs, moving to an area of low oxygen concentration into your red blood cells, because the blood is coming to your lungs to fuel up on oxygen, plus you're getting rid of CO2, so you've got high concentration of CO2 at the blood space moving into the alveolus, or the air sacs of your lungs, for you to then breathe out. This happens through simple diffusion. So when we think back to our cell stuff, we have oxygen and CO2 through simple diffusion moving across cell membranes from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And here's just a diagram of the respiratory zone. You won't have to remember all of these terms, just be able to tell me that the grape-looking things are ear sacs or alveoli, and that the smallest twigs that hold these are called your bronchioles. And this is our respiratory zone. Okay, so that's the structures. Now we're going to look at the physiology of how we breathe. Now this can be a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try and really simplify it and introduce this concept, which is Boyle's model. And Boyle's model states that whenever volume in a space gets bigger, then the pressure inside that space gets smaller. On the flip side, whenever volume or space gets smaller, pressure goes up. So that's called an inverse relationship. So when pressure goes up, volume goes down. When volume goes up, pressure goes down. So volume and pressure have an inverse or opposite relationship. That is the fundamental concept for how our body manipulates pressure outside and inside our lungs for us to breathe. So pulmonary ventilation is the same term as breathing, is all based on this law. And understanding this is actually the concept for the long answer question this week. So let's split it into the first part of pulmonary ventilation, which is inspiration, and that just means breathing in, so getting air inside our system. So what happens is our diaphragm, which looks like this underneath our ribs, contracts and pulls down. We have muscles in between our ribs called our external intercostal muscles. They contract and lift our ribs up. So what we've done is created a bigger space inside our thoracic cavity. Remember, when volume goes up, pressure goes down. So what we've done is we've decreased pressure inside of our thoracic cavity to the point where it's lower than what the pressure is outside. And the pressure outside stays relatively the same. It changes based on like weather and temperature, but it's relatively the same. As soon as we have a situation where the air outside, the air pressure outside is more than the air pressure inside, then air will flow from an area of high pressure into an area of low pressure. So air gets drawn into our lungs to keep that pressure gradient the same. So diaphragm comes down, ribs expand through contraction of external intercostal muscles, bigger volume, decrease in pressure, it becomes lower than the pressure outside, so air flows in. And here's what's happening physically in terms of structure. Full inspiration, so that's looking at your rib cage from a bird's eye view. Your thoracic cavity, which is the cavity between your, like from your clavicle down to your diaphragm, that space gets bigger, pressure goes down, air moves from high pressure to low pressure, and it's getting bigger because your diaphragm pulls down and the muscles between your ribs expand. You won't need to remember these atmospheric pressure numbers. Just be aware that pulmonary ventilation is based on changing the pressure internally. Expiration is exactly the opposite. So for air to come out of our lungs into the outside environment, we need to increase the pressure internally so that it becomes higher than what is outside. So when you relax a muscle, it'll come back to close to its resting state. So your diaphragm is now contracted and flat. When you relax, it starts to lift up back to where it was. The weight of your ribs will push down on the lungs, and you're decreasing volume space in your thoracic cavity. Volume goes down, pressure goes up, it becomes higher than the pressure outside, and then air will flow out. So an area of high pressure to an area of lower pressure. The outside pressure isn't changing. We're manipulating pressure inside our thoracic cavity to get air in and to get air out. So here's a look at the mechanics of what's happening. The thoracic cavity is getting smaller, so the arrows are saying that space is coming in. It's to do with your intercostal muscles and diaphragm relaxing, the weight of your ribs coming back in, creating an increase in internal pressure, air moves out. This slide is just to sort of acknowledge that this can be tricky to understand. The main thing to focus on is what muscles, what structures are creating the volume change. Once you know what the volume is doing of the space, and the space is our thoracic cavity, then you flip it around and go pressure is opposite. If pressure is high internally, then air is going to go out. If pressure is low internally, then air is going to come in. So now gas exchange is different to pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation was moving air in and air out, and air is made up of lots of different types of gases, mostly nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other things. But gas exchange is actually moving a particular gas within that mixture from one space to another. So gases diffuse across cell membranes from an area of high concentration to low, and it's measured in partial pressures, but just remember where there's lots to where there's not a lot. Okay, so if we think about breathing air in, there is a lot of oxygen compared to our blood, so oxygen is going to move from lungs to blood. There's lots of CO2 in our blood, there's less in our lungs, so CO2 is going to move from our blood to our lungs quite easily. Oxygen is carried by our red blood cells using a protein called hemoglobin, and carbon dioxide can be carried by red blood cells, but also as carbonic acid. Alright, so I use this analogy to help define external and internal respiration. So it's called We're looking at a lung bus and the blood train. So the bus is describing air moving from outside into your lungs and then back out. So the bus only ever goes to the lungs and back, whereas the train is your cardiovascular system moving blood all around your system. So this is external respiration. At the mouth, oxygen jumps on the lung bus, and you inhale. So that bus heads to your lungs. So it heads to the little grapes of your lungs. At the lungs, oxygen only jumps off the bus because there's lots of it on the bus, and it diffuses into your body's cardiovascular system, or the blood that's at the lungs. So we call this getting on the blood train. Well, the opposite is happening from the train to the bus. So you've got CO2 on the train because it's just come from the body where it's been generating ATP. CO2 goes from the train onto the bus. The bus then moves out of your lungs, so you breathe out to get rid of CO2, and then the blood train, which is full now of oxygen, starts to move around the system. So external respiration is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 at the lungs with the blood. External respiration, lungs and blood, blood to lungs, both way. O2 from the lungs into the blood, CO2 from your blood into your lungs. That's external respiration. And that's because breathing in is actually an external structure. Everything in your respiratory system is exposed to the outside environment. Whereas internal respiration is when the blood train moves oxygen around the system and it gets to some tissues or cells that need oxygen to generate ATP. It's the gas exchange between oxygen getting from your blood into your cells and CO2 going from your cells back into your blood. So oxygen gets off the train, jumps into a working skeletal muscle, for example. The CO2 that's being produced from aerobic ATP production comes out of the cell and jumps on the blood train, and then that train carries on back to the lungs where external respiration happens and we breathe it out. So internal respiration is the gas exchange between your blood and your cells and cells and your blood. Here's just a complicated diagram of what that looks like. You don't need to remember all this chemistry that's in here. Just know that from your blood to your lungs, you've got CO2 unloading, and from your lungs to your blood, you've got O2 loading, and that's our external respiration. And internal respiration, you've got your cells loading up CO2 into the blood, and your blood unloading O2 to your cells, and that's internal respiration. External respiration, lungs and blood. Internal respiration, blood and body, or blood and cells. Okay, so now we're going to look at cardiovascular system, so the transport system of what we've just been talking about in terms of gases. Delivers oxygen, nutrients to body tissues, carries away wastes. It also transports things like hormones, nutrients. We have a heart which pumps blood around a system or network of vessels. Now, the main function for the cardiovascular system is transportation. So there is a question in the online quiz that asks about function. Transportation is your go-to. So transport or transportation is correct. The body is between 60 and 80% fluid by volume. This volume of fluid needs to be moved around in order to maintain or supplying all of the cells of the body with what it needs. Think of your cardiovascular system as a pick-up and drop-off system. So we're picking up and dropping off oxygen and CO2, picking up and dropping off nutrients and wastes, picking up and dropping off hormones. Blood carries these substances, and the heart pumps blood through the different vessels. So here's our three different structures of the cardiovascular system, and we're going to save the heart for next week. We'll look at the structure of the heart next week, and today we're going to look at blood and the vessels that carry blood. So as we know, blood is the fluid that circulates through the system, transporting substances, gases, nutrients, wastes, hormones, all of those things we talked about. We know that blood cells are produced in our bone marrow. This process is called hematopoiesis, and blood roughly makes up 8% of your total body weight. The blood that runs through your blood vessels is called whole blood because it's a mixture of three different types of cells that are suspended in liquid called plasma. I'm going to look at these cells. You might have heard of normal hematocrit. If you take a blood sample, put it in a little beaker, put it in the centrifuge, which just creates this spinning force which separates the different constituents of blood, we have these three things left over. So you got plasma, which is very much like water, 55% of what your blood is made of. Then you have this buffy coat, which is leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and also platelets, which aren't technically cells, but are often grouped as blood cells. And then erythrocytes, which is red blood cells, and they make up 45%. This is the most dense component. And what we mean by dense is that plasma is quite low in viscosity or thickness. It's pretty much water. So if you think about pouring getting a glass of water from a tap and pouring it out, that's kind of the thickness of your blood plasma. If you had just red blood cells in a cup, it would be more like honey. And these red blood cells look like this sort of disc shape, and you've got 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells. Each of those red blood cells can hold 250 odd million hemoglobin proteins, and each hemoglobin protein can bind with 4 different oxygen molecules. So that just shows you the capacity for oxygen carrying that your red blood cells have. Leukocytes, they're our body's defenses. We'll look at that in the last part of this block of content. And then platelets are essential for clotting blood and repairing damaged vessels. So you've got platelets which can patch holes in blood vessels. They help with the initial blocking of that hole, and then you have these other connective tissue structures that come along later, like fibrin, to help restore and rebuild that tissue. Platelets are like a plug. We'll look a bit more into this homeostatic balance when we look at endocrine system, but fundamentally reproducing red blood cells can be based on oxygen levels. So if you've got low levels of oxygen, then this can stimulate your kidneys to release a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. That stimulates red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, erythropoiesis, and that increases oxygen carrying capacity, bringing blood levels back up to normal. So over a long period of time, training can trigger this to happen, so that you actually have more red blood cells in the system. But it's also something that can be manipulated and used as a performance enhancing system. So supplementing with EPO, a synthetic version of EPO, can increase blood cell production, which could ultimately increase endurance potential for athletes. All right, if we look at our blood vessels, 3 main vessels: arteries, capillaries, and then veins. Arterioles are just small arteries, and venules are just small veins. And I've got this arrow system working to show that blood flows from an artery to an arteriole to a capillary to a venule back to a vein. And then the heart sits in between all of that. And your blood moves from a big structure to smaller structure. Think of these vessels as like the blood's highway system. Some rules to remember is arteries always carry blood away from the heart. It means that most of the time blood going out of the heart has a high lot of oxygen, but not always. Veins always carry blood into the heart, and capillaries are the site of substrate diffusion. So it's your capillaries that have the semi-permeable membranes that allow oxygen and CO2 to move between your blood and your lungs, or your lungs and your blood, or your blood and your cells, or your cells and your blood. Arteries are different to veins in terms of having thick walls. So that bottom right picture is your thick artery walls. They receive blood from the heart, so they need to withstand higher blood pressure. They also have a lot of smooth muscle within that structure that helps constrict or dilate. Veins have thinner walls. They provide less resistance to blood flow, and that's because they are not receiving blood directly from the heart, but returning blood. They also have these valves inside of them that stop blood flowing backwards. Because there's less pressure, there is a bigger chance of blood flowing backwards, but they have one-way valves. So as soon as blood moves through your veins, they are trapped, the blood is trapped from going backwards, so it's always heading back towards the heart. Venous return is just describing deoxygenated blood, so blood that has been and delivered its oxygen, loaded up with CO2, coming back to the heart, and usually it's quite far away, right, from your heart. So in order to get that blood back to your heart, things like skeletal muscle contraction squashes the veins in your system. That causes blood to go in one direction back towards your heart, and the valves which close stop blood flowing backwards. So my understanding is that varicose veins, which if anyone has seen that or experienced it, is when these valves are damaged and blood flow is now going pooling and coming back down when it shouldn't, and that creates a stagnant blood which can further corrode these veins. Treatment is to actually remove those veins and divert blood in different directions. Sporting context or massage context, active recovery, so through walking and moving, can help venous return. Physical massage can help move blood back to the heart also. Veins use the action of muscle contractions combined with their one-way valves to help return blood back to the heart against gravity. So staying still doesn't help with venous return. So if you're flying long haul in a plane, compression is one way to increase blood flow, but also getting up and moving around is important also. Our capillaries, functional unit of the cardiovascular system, they provide areas for exchange of gases, nutrients, hormones, and waste products. So this is our blood train. Once the train enters capillaries, that's when it can unload its passengers. So in this case, we're talking about oxygen to cells and CO2 to come back on the train. Thin walls, super small, they allow simple diffusion to happen. Here's a zoomed up version of an artery on the left where blood can veer off through a capillary. It can feed some kind of body cell or a skeletal muscle or the brain. Oxygen is dropped off, CO2 is picked up, and then that blood carries on back into the cycle of dropping off and enters low pressure vein, where venous return starts to move that blood back to the heart on its way to the lungs to drop off that CO2, pick up some oxygen. So think of generally our arteries are dropping off oxygen, and our veins are generally dropping off CO2, and then our pickup is picking up oxygen from the lungs or dropping off CO2 at the lungs. This is just a zoomed up version of our capillaries. You can see that a red blood cell fits in quite tightly, and that's to allow that gas exchange to happen. You've also got these rubber band things called sphincters, which shut off capillaries when you don't need them. So if you think about being cold, those sphincters will shut off the capillaries so that blood flow is limited to your skin when you're trying to keep yourself warm. If cells are demanding oxygen, then those will open up and allow blood flow to happen to those cells that require more oxygen. Here's just another diagram of what I've shown previously. I don't need to really go through this. It just shows you a real life microscopic view of all the little capillaries surrounding those blue tissue cells. So they could be, they don't look like muscle cells, they could be brain cells. Okay, blood pressure is something that we will touch on in the tutorial. Blood pressure is the amount of pressure that your blood exerts against blood vessel walls as your heart pumps. Blood pressure rises with each contraction. That's your systolic pressure. So when heart contracts, blood comes out, pushes blood against your artery walls. That's your systolic pressure. And then blood pressure falls when your heart relaxes. That's your diastolic pressure. But there's always a certain amount of pressure in your blood vessels. The picture here shows that when blood leaves the heart, your systolic and diastolic pressure are quite high. As that blood moves through the system and ends up in our veins, that pressure gets really, really low. And that's why arteries have high, thick walls, because they receive a lot of pressure, and why veins have valves, because there's not a lot of pressure, decreased blood flow. We need those valves to stop blood going backwards. Blood pressure changes from minute to minute. It's not affected by only activity and rest, but also by temperature, your diet, your emotional state, posture, medication. So an isolated blood pressure test is only going to tell you what your blood pressure is right now. You'd have to ask a whole lot of questions around what they've done previous to give you a clear idea of what chronic blood pressure looks like. You'd also want to measure blood pressure on a regular basis if you're worried that somebody had chronic high blood pressure. This is just a blood pressure response to exercise. As you increase intensity of exercise, your systolic number, or the pressure that is created when your heart contracts, goes up, and that makes sense because you'll see down the bottom is workload. As workload goes up, increased blood flow is needed, demand for ATP is increasing, so forceful contractions are happening. But when your heart relaxes, it's also filling up, so it means that the diastolic pressure needs to relax back to normal levels to allow your heart to fill up properly. So systolic pressure will go up during exercise. Your diastolic, or your resting or relaxation pressure of the heart, should stay relatively the same. And it's your diastolic pressure that gives you a good indicator of somebody's health risk. If their diastolic pressure is high, so anything above sort of 90 is getting a little bit high for diastolic pressure, it means that even when the heart is relaxing, is filling, that there is still some high pressure in the system, and over a long time that can break down some of the structures of that system. Okay team, that's this stuff was quite full on, quite heavy. Trust the process, try not to panic, hit up those Quizlet resources, do your own visuals in terms of YouTube clips, do some reading in some of the textbooks. Nice job.